So it's my great pleasure to introduce Gillian Russell. So she, I think you're still waiting to move to Dianoia Institute of Philosophy at ACU Melbourne. And you're also associated with University of St. Andrews. And so Gillian is professor in philosophy, working mostly on metaphysics, philosophy of language, and social and political philosophy. And today she will be combining framework from Lewis applied to social phenomena. So the floor is yours. Great to have you.
Thank you. I wanted to say thanks to Mahela and everybody at ZAS who's been involved in organizing this. It's been really fascinating couple of days for me, and I'm looking forward to tomorrow as well. And of course, excited to have a chance to present this work to you. So the paper that I'm going to present to you now is a paper that combines a couple of really different things that don't normally go together. So the first is David Lewis's account of the truth conditions for counterfactuals by giving a certain kind of logic and having those counterfactuals be logical constants in this logic. And the second thing is subordination in the social and political sense of subordination. When I give the hour-long version of this presentation, I spend quite a lot of time talking about subordination and kind of trying to motivate, especially for the logicians, why they would be interested in subordination and why they should like try doing this kind of thing with logic. And since I have to get this down to half an hour or so, and I don't want to just squish it all together and do it really, really fast, I'm going to kind of chop off the head of the paper. And so I won't do the part where I talk about subordination, in part because I think the audience that I have here actually knows a fair bit about that already. Yeah, okay. And then, you know, in part because it lets me get to the bit that I actually want to present to you faster. I am going to talk a little bit about why you might be interested in doing what I'm doing in this paper, though, because it can seem like taking two very, very different things and trying to make them work together. And the reason I got interested in it is because I was invited to a conference on feminist formal logic. And I thought, formal logic, I like that. I'm a feminist. That sounds good. It'd be really cool if there was this thing called feminist formal logic that I could find out about. So I'll go to this conference. And the conference was very cool and very interesting, but almost nothing that I saw there was what I expected when I thought I was going to learn about feminist formal logic. There was a lot of stuff about the history of logic. There was a lot of stuff that was sort of feminist formal systems in some sense, but in the kind of logic that I had in mind, where logic was the study of the entailment relation and the kind of thing you would do in a logic class in a philosophy department, there wasn't anything that was quite like that. And so it made me wonder, like, could there even be a feminist formal logic? Like, what would that look like? And this paper is in part like one answer to that question. So I think there are various different ways you could end up with feminist formal logic, the same way there are like various different conceptions of feminist science. But one conception of feminist science is as science that studies the gender hierarchy and gender norms. That's one of Liz Anderson's conceptions of feminist science. And so one way you might think you could get feminist logic is by having logic that studied gender norms and gender hierarchies. Some people think that logic can't study anything, that logic doesn't have a subject matter, right? And if that's what you think, then you're not going to think that this kind of feminist formal logic is a possibility. But not everybody thinks that, and there's been a renaissance recently of people doing logic and kind of using it to theorize about different domains. And so one place that we've seen that is with Tim Williamson, a modal logic, and thinking of a modal logic, which is a really systematic theory of modality. And so you might wonder, okay, if we are allowed to have logic, sort of particular subject areas, could there be some kind of logic that would count as feminist logic? And one thing that I picked up from reading people like Mary Kate McGowan and Mary Langton, Nishant Maitra, is the importance of like hierarchy in thinking about feminist issues. So thinking about, subordination is like one of the key aspects of that, being this hierarchy. Of course, it's not just gender, there's all kinds of hierarchies. But then here's a thought. There's actually some precedent for logic studying hierarchies. Okay, we're not normally thinking about hierarchies of people. We're thinking about things like hierarchies of numbers. So when we do mathematical logic, you have the standard model, there are all the natural numbers and they're ordered by the less than relation, and we have a certain formal language that captures some of this, and then we do some logic. So it's not like logic can't study hierarchies. There's another way in which hierarchy comes in formal logic, and we've got this sort of precedent for studying it. And it's David Lewis thinking about counterfactuals and thinking about hierarchies of possible worlds. So worlds ordered in terms of their similarity to the actual world. And if you approach things that way, you start out with some models and you add some stuff to the models. So Lewis adds these kind of nested spheres that order the possible worlds. And then some of your logical expressions, for example, your counterfactuals, get their truth conditions through reference to these aspects of the model. And that has interesting consequences for, say, validity or failure of validity. And so it seems legitimately something that you would call a logic. It's really about the entailment relation on a language. And it's like deeply influenced by this like hierarchical aspect of the model. And so there's this thought, could we do something like that, but not with possible worlds, not with overall similarity, but with people and hierarchy. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to share the handout, which is also in the chat, I think, if you want your own copy. All right. And since we're a little bit pushed for time, I'm just going to jump ahead to this section on page 1 that says spheres of possible worlds. So in Lewis's counterfactuals, the actual world is just one among many worlds, W0, W1, etc., getting along in a modal space W. Each W is associated with a set of spheres $W. So dollar is a function that takes you from a possible world to the set of spheres around W. And so $W, that's the set of spheres associated with W, which must meet the following 4 constraints. Okay, so let me get these list of conditions which the sets have to meet. And I'm going to talk through a couple of these just to give you kind of an idea of what's going on here. But the crucial thing is not like any particular one of these conditions so much as the way we're going to justify these conditions, right? And the way we justify them is by saying, look, the whole point of these sets of spheres is to capture overall comparative similarity on possible worlds. Right, so for example, we have this condition centering. And centering says the singleton set of W that just has W in it is always going to be one of the spheres around $W. And that's justified like this. You say, look, there's one world that is more similar to W than any other world, namely W. There might be some other worlds that are like really, really similar. Maybe they're qualitatively identical or something like that. But still, W has this property that no other world has. It's the one that's identical to W. Right? And so it's always going to be the most similar to W. And so we have this like smallest sphere that just has W in it to represent. That's the sort of the winner of the hierarchy, right? The thing that's most comparatively similar to W. We also have this condition nesting. Nesting says if you have any 2 spheres, T and S, then one of them has to be a subset of the other. So what it rules out is that you get this kind of situation So I'm like drawing on the screen now. Here's one of the spheres. Here's another sphere, but neither of these spheres is a subset of the other. And then we might have W here and two different possible worlds, W1 and W2. Okay, so why we don't have this situation, why we don't allow it, is we might have this question, which is most overall comparatively similar to W? Is it W1 or is it W2? And in this situation, we can only say, well, there's one respect in which W1 is more similar to W. It's a member of like this sphere here. And there's this other respect in which W2 is more similar to W. It's a member of this sphere here. And so we get no answer to the question, which is overall comparatively more similar. So we don't allow that situation. Okay, there's a couple of other conditions, but since they're not super crucial, I will just press on. There are 4 different things I'm going to talk about in this talk that Lewis does with these systems of spheres. And I'm going to get to the others in a bit, but the most complicated one, the one that takes like the most brain power to follow, is this one. So I'm going to go through it first. Right? So it's giving truth conditions for counterfactual conditionals. So in this box towards the bottom of page 1 of the handout, we've given the truth conditions for this strange symbol. It has a box with a right arrow coming out of it. So I'll call that the box arrow. And it's supposed to be the form of a counterfactual conditional, like if kangaroos had no tails, then they would fall over. So here A is the kangaroos having no tails, B is them falling over. And so this counterfactual, we want to know, like, what are the truth conditions for it? And according to this account, A box arrow B is true at some world W, assuming we've got a system of spheres on the set of possible worlds, if and only if either, and now there are 2 possible ways the counterfactual can be true. One of them is the trivial way. No A world belongs to any sphere S in $W. Okay, so that's represented by this diagram at the bottom of the page. So the idea is, say W in the middle of that circle, that's the actual world. And we're interested in this counterfactual. Okay, if kangaroos squared the circle, they would fall over. And the thought is that worlds in which kangaroos square the circle are so far different from the actual world, they don't even make it into any of these spheres. So either there are no A worlds, or they aren't in any of the spheres. And in that case, the counterfactual gets to be trivially true. But then the interesting case is the non-trivial truth case. So some sphere S in $W contains at least one A world, and the material conditional, if A then B, holds at every world in that sphere. So that's what's supposed to be represented by this diagram over the page. Let's clear that out. So this time we're entertaining the counterfactual. If kangaroos had no tails, they would fall over. And the thought is that the A finger that's kind of pointing into this diagram, that covers the worlds where kangaroos have no tails. And the B, that's the worlds in which they fall over. So there is a sphere in this diagram which contains some A worlds. And it is such that within that sphere, all the A worlds are B worlds, right? So this one here, I just color in a bit here, right? The sphere that I'm coloring in right now, it has some A worlds in it. And also those A worlds are completely covered by the B world finger, so they're all B worlds. And so the counterfactual comes out true. However, we're not requiring that in the model, all the A worlds are B worlds, right? And in particular, in this space here, where I just put a little X, there are some A worlds that are not B worlds. That you can think of as representing situation Lewis considers, which is, what if there were kangaroos, they had no tails, but they used crutches? And the thought is, well, now they're not going to fall over because they can use the crutches to stay upright. However, the world where kangaroos have no tails but use crutches is more dissimilar from the actual world than a world where they merely have no tails. And so if kangaroos had no tails, they would fall over, comes out true, even though like the strict conditional, the boxed material conditional, would not come out true because there are some worlds where kangaroos have no tails and don't fall over. Okay, so there are also two ways for these counterfactuals to be false, but we will just press on, having noticed the interesting way for them to be true. And here's where we're going to go. So each of us is just one among many persons, P0, P1, P2, etc., getting along in a social space, U. Suppose people are organized into a set of social spheres, R, where these spheres are intended to convey information about social rank. The smaller the spheres of which an individual P is a member, the higher P's rank. Social rank, unlike comparative similarity, need not be relative to a third person. It's a binary rather than a ternary relation. That will make more sense, I think, if you try to imagine what it would be like if social rank were relative to a third person. So when we're looking at the possible world situation, we've always got the actual world, right? And then we're interested about, say, W1 and W2, which one is most similar to the actual world, right? But if we're doing it in sort of social hierarchy, it's not like there's always one person who's the winner of the hierarchy, or there needn't be, right? So there could be lots of different ways the social world is organized, and it isn't always going to have like an empress who's like the one person at the top of the social hierarchy, right? So maybe there's nobody at the top, maybe there's some shared thing at the top, maybe there's an infinite number of people at the top, but given that we're not going to have this top person, we can't just do overall comparative social rank by how close are you to the empress. So instead, we'll just have like P1 and P2, and we'll talk about which one is higher socially ranked. Okay, so it's a binary relation. So we don't need to think of our system of spheres as a function, $P from a person P, but can simply regard it as a fixed set of sets, social spheres R, defined on the domain of persons U. So yeah, you just have your set of spheres on the domain of people. And then we can ask, what constraints on the system of spheres would be justified given our goal of representing overall social rank? Well, for a start, we're not going to have centering. So if you look at the constraints that I have here for the social spheres, and you kind of go back over the page and look at the ones for possible worlds, we basically have 1, 2, and 3, and we've dropped centering. So, okay, I'll just keep drawing blue lines on the hand. Okay, so we still have nesting, we have unions, we have intersections. Okay, and what we have now is kind of a ranking of people. If you have a domain here, it's my domain of individuals, can draw these spheres in, and basically if you're in this circle, say you're in here in the middle, then you're a member of all the spheres, right? And essentially the more spheres that you're a member of, the higher your rank. So if you have a friend and your friend is a member of a social club of one of these spheres and you're not, right, then you're lower social ranked than they are. Okay, so why would anybody want to go and do something like that? Like, what's the point of doing this? Why would it be useful? So I'm going to try to answer this question in the time that I have left in a really flat-footed way. I am going to look at what Lewis can do with his systems of spheres for ordering possible worlds. And we're going to see that there are 4 different things that I can identify. And for each of these things, we're going to see if we can do something analogous with the systems of social spheres. Okay, so here are the 4 things. First one is you can use Lewis's systems of spheres to give truth conditions for ordinary modal claims like box P and diamond P. So it doesn't have to be anything as fancy as a counterfactual. You can just have the unary box and diamond. But then, as we've already seen, you can give truth conditions for counterfactual conditionals as well. And you can identify counterfactual fallacies. So Lewis looks at particular argument forms such that if you'd used the strict conditional, these forms would have been truth preserving. But using the counterfactual conditional with Lewis's interpretation of it, there are models where the premises are true and the conclusion is false. And then finally, you can also, and Lewis does this in like later work, use these models to explain some of the pragmatic features of counterfactual utterances. So I'm thinking here, what happens when you use a counterfactual in a conversation? You just come out and assert one. What does that do to the scoreboard? Okay, so what we're going to do now is look at those 4 things and try to make them work in the social cases. Okay, so the first one is just the ordinary modal operators, box and diamond. I'm going to throw this quote from Douglas Adams in here, but I'm not going to explain it. I think it will start to make more sense as we go on. Many men, of course, became extremely rich, but this was perfectly natural and nothing to be ashamed of, because no one was really poor, at least no one worth speaking of. Okay, so we're starting with a simple case. Lewis's systems of spheres continue to allow us to interpret the unary modal operators box and diamond. So if you're used to thinking of modal logic with an accessibility relation, and you think that, say, box P is going to be true just in case every world accessible from the world that you're looking at is such that P is true there, then these spheres are just going to replace the accessibility relation. So now when you say box P, you're saying P is true throughout a certain sphere. Okay. But which sphere, right? So we have this whole system of spheres. We could be quantifying over the smallest one. We could be quantifying over something in the middle. Seems like there are 2 options here, right? One is maybe we could have different operators for different spheres. So if you can imagine, we could number the spheres, and then we could have a different operator with a subscript with that number for each domain of quantification. But that's not the only way you can go. You could also have a single box operator and have it disambiguated by conversational context. So suppose we go with that way of proceeding. Box A is true at a world W, just in case A is true throughout the sphere of accessibility determined by $W and the conversational context C. And of course, you can do this with a diamond as well. This is a part where I normally talk about accommodation for a bit, and there's this thought that if you assert the following thing is necessary or the following thing is impossible, and it's only going to make sense, it's only going to come out as true if we're presupposing certain things, like we're quantifying over this set of possible worlds, then following Lewis's rule of accommodation, the scoreboard shifts so that the domain of quantification is now that set, right? But in this company, I think I don't need to talk about accommodation too much, so let's just assume that accommodation is helping us fix which set we're quantifying over. Okay, here's a problem. Worlds are things relative to which a sentence gets a truth value, but persons are not, right? So we've got this, let's see, domain. We've got this model, and here are the worlds in it. And we want to know like whether box P is true. And so we're looking at whether at each of these worlds, P comes out true. But if these things are not worlds, but people, well, we don't normally think that sentences get different truth values relative to different people. Maybe there are some like special ones like that predicate like adjectives of taste or something that gets some special relative treatment that's relative to persons. But generally, like we don't build it into our logic that like snow is white is going to get a different truth value relative to different people. So given that, we can't just say, you know, box P is going to be true just in case P is true for all the people. But we could do this. One thing that does vary over people is the satisfaction of a one-place predicate. So if we had this predicate, I don't know, P of X, right? We can ask for each of these people, do they satisfy P of X? And then we could have something that comes out true just in case they all satisfy P of X, or something that comes out true just in case one or some of them satisfy P of X. And that looks a lot like a quantifier. Okay, so solution, the monotheoretic analog for the truth of a sentence, when the object is an individual rather than a world, is the satisfaction of a one-place predicate. And the syntactically appropriate expression for quantifying over individuals isn't a sentential operator, but a unary first-order quantifier, a device that syntactically attaches to predicates to form sentences, and model theoretically to sets to give truth values. Okay, so having figured that out, here are some truth clauses for monadic social quantifiers. They're kind of the social analog of these, the box and the diamond. So for all alpha A is usually going to be something that has alpha free in it somewhere. That would be true just in case A is satisfied by every member of the social sphere S, determined by R and the conversational context C. But you could also have exists alpha A is true just in case A is satisfied by at least one member of the social sphere, determined by R and the conversational context C. And most alpha A, which would be true just in case the cardinality of the set of things that satisfy A within S is greater than the cardinality of the set of things that don't satisfy A within S. Okay, so we can generalize these quantifiers beyond just for all and exists. But one possibility is that they could be used to interpret sentences like the ones on the right-hand side in the handout. So a lot of these sentences are going to sound kind of snotty. They sound like they're being said by somebody who is like kind of sensitive to, or at least only paying attention to, what they regard as the important people in some way. Okay, so most people have seen Hamilton. What I'm thinking of here is that Hamilton is this incredibly successful musical that's been out for many years now. It's toured around various cities. It's even been on television now. And so if you're a certain kind of person living in a certain kind of place with certain kind of other people, you might sort of breezily say, yeah, most people have seen Hamilton now. But in fact, tickets for Hamilton were incredibly expensive. They were hard to get for a long time. When it toured, it mostly went to very urban areas. And if you wanted to watch it on television, you had to be subscribed to a particular channel. So in fact, if you mean everyone, right, really everyone, it's not true that most people have seen Hamilton. Or I'm not going to get stuck in this job, I'm going to be someone. Although, of course, even the people who get stuck in the job are someone when you quantify more broadly. Everyone from the manor goes to London for the season. I'm thinking of this as sort of Downton Abbey type case where that means the wealthy adults in the family go to London for the season, but the children and the servants, they stay behind. Everyone should own a gun. So if you imagine this said by a racist member of the NRA, and they don't mean to include the Black Panthers among the everyone. Okay, so hopefully you kind of get the idea, but this is not yet something that would be like a counterfactual, but for the social case and for quantifiers. So those quantifiers that we're just looking at, they're just unary quantifiers. They take one place predicate and they form a sentence, a bit like the way the box and the diamond take one sentence and form a new sentence. But the counterfactual is a binary modal operator. So it takes two sentences to form a sentence. And so the syntactic analog of that would be taking two one-place predicates to form a sentence, which would be a binary quantifier. Right? So the syntax for this sort of analogous thing to a counterfactual is going to look like this one at the top of page 5. If A and B are formulas and alpha is a variable over individuals, then for all two, this two is just to show that it's the binary version of the universal quantifier. Alpha AB is a formula. And then sort of the easiest way to interpret this, which in fact is not the analog of the counterfactual, this would be the analog of the strict conditional, is to say for all two alpha AB is true if and only if all the things that satisfy alpha are a subset of the things that satisfy beta. So all the A's are B's. Right? But we're going to have to mess with that interpretation if we want to get variability with social rank. So here's how we do it. this is the analog of the truth conditions for the counterfactual. So for all 2v, alpha AB is true if and only if either, and now we have the trivial clause, there are no A's, right? So no individual in any sphere in R satisfies A. So that's either there are no A's or the A's are so important and unimportant and not worth thinking about that we're not going to count them. Or some individual in some sphere in S, sphere S does satisfy A, and within that sphere, all the A's are B's. So the vacuous truth case is the first diagram on page 5. And I thought you might think of this as an interpretation of all werewolves are hungry. And so we're thinking either there are no werewolves or the werewolves are so like socially deprecated that we're not gonna like count them when we talk about them. So it comes out vacuously true that all werewolves are hungry by clause 1. But the interesting case, of course, is the non-vacuous truth case. So think about this one. All women are permitted to vote. And imagine that the circumstance is this: we're in Australia, it's 1906, there's just been a law passed saying that in every territory and state in the country, women are allowed to vote now. Okay. And so you might say, okay, all women are permitted to vote. Right? If you're in Australia, you might clearly mean here and now. However, Indigenous suffrage lagged behind women's suffrage in Australia. And so in 1906, some women were permitted to vote, but if you're an Indigenous woman, you were not. So you can imagine somebody saying all women are permitted to vote. That's going to come out true in those circumstances, right? So I said these quantifiers are kind of like snotty sounding, right? That it comes out true because there is some sphere, namely this one, that has some women in it. And when you look at that sphere, all the women in that sphere are also G, right? They're also permitted to vote. However, there are some women out here who are considered less important by presumably the speaker, who are women and are not permitted to vote, but that doesn't stop the sentence from being true. The same way that the kangaroos who had crutches not falling over didn't stop Lewis's counterfactual. If kangaroos didn't have tails, they would fall over, from being true. Okay, so that's the second application. Just looking at where I am in time, so I'm probably supposed to finish up pretty fast. So let me see what I can say about the third and the fourth. Okay, the third one is the fallacies. You can kind of see, given the examples that I've given, why strengthening the antecedent would be fallacious. So if kangaroos didn't have tails, they would fall over. Strengthening the antecedent is adding a conjunct to the antecedent. So we say, if kangaroos didn't have tails, but they used crutches, they would fall over. Lewis says the first one's true, the second one's false. And so this is not truth preserving, it's a fallacy. But you could do a similar thing given these quantifiers. So all women are permitted to vote comes out true, but as soon as you add that new conjunct, the Indigenous women, that makes it false. All right, last thing. The last thing is about the pragmatics of what happens when you just assert something during a conversation and what it does to the scoreboard. So Lewis, given that he's given us truth conditions for counterfactuals, right? You might think that we could figure out whether some counterfactuals are true, right? At least if we know enough about the circumstance, we could like apply these truth conditions and see if they're satisfied. So here are a couple of counterfactuals. They're taken from Quine, and it's supposed to be part of the situation that they can't both be true. It has to be one or the other. So at most, one of them is going to be true. So we're talking about the US-Korean War, and one of the counterfactuals is, if Caesar had been in command, he would have used the atomic bomb. And the other one is, if Caesar had been in command, he would have used catapults. And so I think to myself, okay, I've got truth conditions for counterfactuals now. Can I figure out which of these is true? And Lewis says, no, you can't. And the reason you can't is that those truth conditions make reference to the ranking of possible worlds in terms of similarity. And Lewis thinks that can be kind of vague and underdetermined. So if we're thinking about, what's really important in similarity is like Caesar's character and that he's like the man he was or something like this, then you might think that the closest possible worlds where he's in charge are ones where he uses the atomic bomb. But if you're thinking, I'm really interested in his like knowledge and like what people in those days knew about warfare, then you might think if Caesar were in charge, he would have used catapults, is the one that comes out true. And so Lewis thinks if you precisify the similarity ranking one way, you get one counterfactual to come out true. And if you precisify it the other way, you get the other one to come out true. So now what happens in a conversation where we're having an argument and then I say, if Caesar had been in command, he would have used the atomic bomb. Well, we like pick up the accommodation tool and we say, well, assuming that you're happy to go along with this, this presupposes a certain ranking of possible worlds. And so that now becomes part of the conversational scoreboard, that ranking. Okay, maybe you object, and in that case, we don't get accommodated in the same way. Okay, but the same thing, I think, could surely happen with social hierarchy. So if you say something that in order for it to be true, a certain hierarchy has to be presupposed, right? Then if you get accommodated, that can get added to the scoreboard. And if you don't, that might prevent it from being added to the scoreboard. So we can have that application too. All right, I've gone on too long, so I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gillian, for a wonderful talk. So already, oh, okay, there are the applauses. So questions in the chat, that would be easier to track. So Lauren, and then Justin.
Hey, thanks for that. I found it super interesting, and I also really want, some more things to counter feminist formal logic and more space for that. So I have two sort of questions about this, and I'll try to do them pretty quickly. One is when you were first starting this, I was sort of thinking about what the social spheres actually are modeling, and insofar as they're modeling hierarchy, I sort of wondered about the subset assumption that you're making. So if you think about sort of intersectional forms of oppression, sort of common to say there's no sort of oppression Olympics where you have this nice sort of ranking. So I sort of wondered a little bit about this sort of ranking. But a thought that I had later after you went through some of the examples is that what you might be doing is forming something like a logic of ignorance. And in a logic of ignorance, if you sort of think about like Mills on white ignorance, it becomes a little bit more appropriate to think about them in this nice sort of ordered way, because that is how people who are at the top of the social hierarchy sort of think about oppression and kind of mistake that some people can make. So I wondered about the use of the subset assumption, and whether things, in reality are a little bit more messy, or whether there is actually a good kind of practical use to put this to in modeling something like ignorance. So that was sort of the first thing I wanted to ask about. And the second thing is I just wanted to ask about one of the particular examples. So about the voting case, I wondered if on your model, it would be possible and even good reasoning for an Indigenous woman to make the following argument. All women can vote, therefore I should be able to vote, right? So that sort of seems in some way like a good argument. I'm not sure whether in the formal model she will be able to do that, or whether there's going to be some shifting context stuff that might not be allowed, but maybe we want to think about whether it would be allowed, and that she's not really contradicting herself in that case.
Yeah, good. Okay, so let me start out with the subset stuff. So I think it's very natural to think that these models are way too simple, right? So they rank people, and like some people are at the same rank and some people are higher and some people are lower, but real life subordination is really complicated. One way in which it's complicated is you get subordinated in like different aspects of who you are. And so I might be subordinated in terms of my gender, but not in terms of my color or my race. And so you get this kind of real life incomparability. So if I have a Black male friend, there's this question, well, who's higher ranked, right? And then, given this, we don't know how to answer it, right? So that seems more realistic than the model where everyone just has a clear rank. It also seems too simple in that there's no context sensitivity built in the following sense, that the hierarchy can vary between different social groups. Like maybe class in the UK is different from class in the US and different from class in Europe, and maybe particular groups have like certain rankings going on, and there's nothing about that in any of this model. So one thing you could do if you're like worried about these aspects is you could start making the model more complex. So you can build in like context sensitivity, and you can build in like, Lewis looks at different ways to model similarity, and he also looks at like loosening the ordering relation. So, what if it's just a pre-ordering? What if it's, and in some ways that seems more realistic, and it includes more detail from the real world in the models. It makes anything you want to do with logic much, much more complicated. So everything takes longer to explain, everything takes longer to set up, some things can't be shown anymore. And what I'm inclined to think is this, that the things we can say about hierarchy, we can also say about ranking in terms of similarity. So, there are possible worlds where my hair is longer than it is now, but the same color. And there are possible worlds where it's like pinker, but the same length. And now there's the question, like, which is most similar? Well, in one respect, one's similar, in one respect, the other's similar. And Lewis is like, yeah, but what we're going to try to model here is overall comparative similarity. That can slide around a bit, but it could still be that in each of these particular situations, there's a hierarchy in the end. Like different things shake out in different ways. All those real world details really come in, but there's still something important that's happened once you've got the hierarchy. And then there can be questions about, okay, what does that do? Like what are the consequences of that? And if we keep it simple, we can end up with a tool where you can use in all of these different situations. So I think what you said is totally right, but it's not necessarily an argument for like doing something different with the logic. There was also the second question about voting. All women can vote, therefore I should be able to vote. So if the Indigenous woman who's using this argument is using the universal quantifier, right, the regular non-variable universal quantifier, then the argument's valid, right? And if she's not, then it might not be. I need to think about it a little bit. Certainly the premise would come out true, and the conclusion, if she says, I can vote, it doesn't follow. This sort of practically, I think the issue is going to be, how does she get interpreted? I think she's likely to be interpreted by the people in power as like not having given a successful argument. But if she's using the regular universal quantifier, she has. It's valid.
Happy, Lauren, or do you have a follow-up? Okay. Next is Justin, and then Alexander.
Thanks. That was super fun. So the preamble to my question is going to seem like it's presupposing, or seems like it's presupposing you don't know what I'm saying, but I'm just going to do the preamble anyway, just so we're all on the same page. But I don't want to necessarily suggest that this sort of thing is not something you've thought about. But so like, Lewis, as you pointed out, is really interested in invalidating these argument forms like antecedent strengthening. But when I turn to the kind of quantificational determiners, and I think this was brought out by Lauren's question, it's a little bit unclear to me that we want to invalidate antecedent strengthening. And in the counterfactuals literature, there's this debate, again, I'm sure you know it, where there's this move that's made by defenders of the kind of non-variably strict theory responding to Lewis, and they say, what's really going on in these cases where there seems to be a violation of antecedent strengthening. So for example, if kangaroos had no tails, they would have toppled over. But if kangaroos had no tails and used crutches, they would have not toppled over, is really a shift in the context of quantification. So you have a sort of strict quantifier over a variable context, a variable domain that's shifting by the context. And then the argument that they give for this is that when you switch the order of these, it sort of it gets a lot worse. So they claim, so if kangaroos had no tails but used crutches, they wouldn't have toppled over. But if kangaroos had no tails, they wouldn't have toppled over. But if kangaroos had no tails, they would have toppled over. And the thought is that's somehow worse. It's a little bit defective. And so I was sort of just thinking about the application of this in your case. So the example that you gave was, all women can vote, but not all Indigenous women can vote, which I think, I can sort of see how that could be potentially uttered felicitously. But then flipping them, I wasn't sure. It sounded a little bit weird. I mean, if it was good, I think that would be really good for you. If it isn't good, that is somewhat of a problem. So we can just reflect, I guess. Not all Indigenous women can vote, but all women can vote. I wasn't totally sure. Anyway, that was the thing I wanted just to see what you thought about this, because it would suggest potentially an alternative, namely that what we want to do here is have just kind of quantifier domain restriction that's kind of be really flexible.
Yeah, so maybe. I don't want to represent myself as more certain here than I am. So it's like an initial question is, like, in the formal language, can you define these kinds of expressions and have them work this way, right? And I think the answer there is clearly yes. And then there's this question about English or empirical languages, like, do any languages actually have any expressions that work this way and that are sensitive to, like, social ordering? And I gotta say, I find it really plausible that there could be. Like, social hierarchy seems something that people are really sensitive to. And so this seems like an interesting possibility. And the thing that seems most like, say, the counterfactuals are like these kind of quantifiers. But then there's the strict question, is this the correct interpretation for any quantifier use in English? And then the rival theory is the sort of analog to the rival theory to Lewis's one in the case of the counterfactuals, which is you do it all with context instead of building it into the semantics. And so I suppose this is a kind of a Lewisian style defense that would say, well, there's more sort of structure and stuff that's going on here than we're consigning things to the wastebasket of context sensitivity that we could actually theorize about in our semantics and like bring out this unity. I don't know whether that's going to work, but I think the place where the hierarchy is needed is the counterfactual. So it's looking at these kind of quantifiers as kind of a way to go. But one possibility is it might not be like explicit quantifiers in English that are best interpreted this way. It might be something like a generic, or so when people say women, so I think people find this a little bit easier, like, oh yeah, women can vote now. Indigenous women can't vote. And they're like, yeah, the strengthening seems to fail. but I don't feel that I'm already at a point where I've like developed the theory enough that it's ready to hold its own against the context sensitivity approach.
Right, the next question from Alexander.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
So I was wondering about this all women are permitted to vote sentence, because I was kind of inclined to say, well, actually that's false in the context you described, because you're just ignoring these women who are women just as all the others are, and maybe even more so in the generic case. But then I thought, I mean, but maybe there would still be some role for these hierarchies to play in terms of like explaining why people say that nonetheless. Because
why do you think even more so in the generic case?
I don't know, because it's,
you don't think people would say women can vote once like everybody except the indigenous women? I mean, people would say women can vote in America, right? But you can't vote if you're not a citizen, and you can't vote if you're incarcerated.
right, yeah.
10, I guess 10 is not women, but okay. You can't vote if you're sexual.
Yeah, I feel like, I think my feeling was like in the universal quantifier, there's some kind of arbitrariness who you count in, and it depends maybe very specifically on the context. But in the generic case, I felt like there's more of a normative, like more of an objective standard of what counts for as relevant for the generic. And then if you think that this entire group doesn't count for the generic, it feels a bit like, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about that. But just generally for the universal quantifier too.
We say like horses give birth to live young, right?
I know, yeah, it's all, yeah, I know, yeah, I shouldn't focus on the generics. But generally, even for the universal quantifier, I felt like I would want to say that's false, because you're ignoring people you shouldn't ignore in that context. But I still thought,
yeah, actually, there's the third theory, right? So there's the Lewis theory of the counterfactuals, there's the context-sensitive strict conditional theory of the counterfactuals, and then there's like the all counterfactuals are false theory of the counterfactuals. The who am I thinking of in at ANU? Ellen Hayek, where you say if kangaroos had no tails, they would fall over. No, that's false, because I can think of a kangaroo with no tail who uses crutches, and he's not going to fall over. So it's just false that if kangaroos had no tails, they'd fall over.
Right, but I mean, I wasn't suggesting that you should always count every woman on the planet, but you know, in certain contexts, it's just inappropriate to ignore certain women. Like, you know, I mean, or I took it like the view where they are all false is just a view where you consider all the worlds, and then you always find one where it doesn't work. But I mean, I just thought it.
You think there might be some additional rules, like you're not allowed to leave out people you're talking to, or
something like
very
that.
Salient, or
yeah. But you might sometimes forget about them, and for systematic reasons. And so I was just, and my feeling was kind of the story you were telling might be more, or I mean, could perhaps maybe be applied to something like that, when you're trying to figure out like, why do people like ignore these women in these contexts and say things like everybody can vote when obviously not everybody can vote. And an explanation might be, well, because they think in terms of these hierarchies, and that's, I don't know, that was a thought I had. I don't know if maybe it's impossible.
It does sound a lot more psychological.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
It's a theory about how we think rather than a theory about the meanings of expressions.
Right, but I mean, like, I was thinking like in this bias literature and stuff, that there are also formal models, like ones that are supposed to be normative and tell you what's, you know, likely and what's not, but then there are also these formal models that are supposed to somehow build in like the structure of our psychology, and then make predictions on that basis. And yeah, I don't know, maybe that goes too far. I was just thinking that could be another kind of application you might have in mind, which struck me as applied to this particular sentence as more plausible, maybe.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question from Amelia.
Thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. I think I'm gonna have to go back and look at the handout like more slowly, because I'm like very unused.
You want me to share it?
Oh, so not right now. I just mean I'm like, I take a long time. It's been ages since I've been thinking about like quantification. So like, I'm not sure I'm totally up to speed, but it's really interesting. I was wondering about kind of in the vein of like genetics, whereas these obviously kind of have these quantifiers. So it seemed like in some of the examples with things like everyone likes such and such, everyone does this. There's kind of, what you have in mind is these kind of hierarchies of like, the relevant context is all the people who matter. And there's kind of a seniority thing. And I was just wondering if you had anything to say about something that's more like a kind of like normalcy ranking that I've seen come up in generics. So kind of like, maybe if I say something about like, most women wear makeup, and I'm not making a kind of seniority ranking so much as like the real women kind of like sense, like the womeniest women. And I wondered if it seems like from what I follow, it could also work for
real men provide, real women appreciate it.
Yeah. So I wondered if you had thoughts on kind of, it seems like this might work for kind of normalcy rather than seniority kind of thing. And I just wondered if you had anything to say on that.
So yeah, it could, and I like it. So one of the sort of notable things about the way this happens and doing something at this level of abstraction is that certainly in this talk, I said very little about what social hierarchy was, right? And the longer version of the talk, I talk about it more, but usually I give a bunch of examples, and it might be something to do with power, it might be something to do with like norms and permissions to do certain things, and but I'm not presupposing any particular understanding of social hierarchy. So pick your favorite theory if you have one and slot it in here. All this model does is say, if people are ordered this way, you can get the following consequences, right? So that ordering could get interpreted in different ways. And in particular, you could interpret it as sort of ordering in terms of closeness to normal. And then, yeah, you get similar results. But I like that. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. And Justin just shared a paper by Plant and Asher on generics, and that's quite good. So we have 3 more minutes. Any other questions, thoughts, remarks? Unless Gillian, you wanted to sort of cover the things that sort of you went very quickly.
Nothing.
After this, we open the like, if people have time to stay with us for another half an hour, but we understand that everyone is kind of short of time. So, but I encourage everyone to sort of, you wanted to say something, and I interrupted you.
I don't have anything to add, if that was me.
Okay.
Can I say something, Gillian?
Yes.
I thought this was super cool, and I think one thing that just to follow up on my question is that it doesn't particularly matter, I think, whether you want to handle this in a variably strict theory or strict theory. Like the point that I think you're drawing on is broader than that, which is like, look, we want to think about these structures, and it could be that the way that the quantifier domain expansion works is via some sort of hierarchy structure in the nested way that you've laid out. And in fact, that's what people think for, even the dynamic semanticists who push back against Lewis. They think, oh, no, there's still an order on worlds, and the domain expands in sort of concert with that order. So it could very well be that you're modeling an aspect of language usage, and it's just that I was taking issue with perhaps the particular semantics you gave for the quantifier, but that really underlying it, and I think this is what you were saying in response to me, is like, it could just be that there really is this hierarchy structure that's in fact underlying the way we negotiate these meanings in context, which I think is really, really, really awesome.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. Yeah, it's useful to think about, this could end up getting developed a lot of different ways, or getting polished a lot of different ways. And yeah, so it's good to know if some of them don't work, but it doesn't mean that there aren't possibilities of other kinds. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Liz? Oh.
So I know we're out of time, but so I just wanted I've been thinking about this. So I was wondering, Gillian, in spirit of Justin's, like stepping back from the particular details details and thinking about like, general use of this kind of machinery. So, Ellen McCready has this work on honorifics and on ways of thinking about ranking of individuals. And, that shows up in very fine-grained ways in, especially Asian languages.
Like in the military? Or...
No, so the idea is like basically like tu vu, but familiar, formal,
okay,
but
right.
like Thai, Japanese, Korean have very different ways of enacting it. And in particular, one of the lessons of her book is that like certain aspects of the hierarchy are semantically encoded in some languages and are merely pragmatically encoded in others. And so you can see very fine-grained differences between the ways that the details of the language are treating it.
Fascinating.
And so, and it partly was Justin, your posting this Asher and Pelletier paper made me think of that connection too. So just thinking
the name of the writer again?
I'll just write so it's Ellen McCready, who was here yesterday, right, Mihaela? And it's called what, like the semantics of honorifics or something like that.
Yeah, that's the new book. Yeah.
And so I really like the spirit, and I think this is in the spirit of what Alexander was saying as well. Like, look, this is great machinery to employ for thinking about how to give a formal model of the phenomena and as it is received by people, and then so in people's heads in some very abstract way, and then we can think about how it gets implemented semantically or pragmatically or whatever, right? And those are different. They're going to be different mechanisms. There's going to be different forms in which that's going to happen, whatever. But the basic point that this is, and then for some of those purposes, you might want to complexify it in the ways Lauren was suggesting. For others, not. Like the basic point that this is all within the realm of formal modeling, and these are the tools for doing that formal modeling. Seems like a really important thing to say.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Any other remarks? I can type this. So yeah, we still have time if there are other burning questions.
Well, then can I go back to asking? I turned that into a comment, but I guess it's more of a question. Like, so one question is about like how ambitious do you want to be? You know what I mean? Like there's how much do you care about Justin's question? Justin was saying you shouldn't care that much about the details of my, are you happy to have deployment across, like, as long as there's a deployment, implementable, useful employment for this kind of machinery, is that good enough for you, or do you really want the particular sort of implementation in quantifiers or counterfactuals?
My initial interest is definitely in feminist logic. So I'm interested in entailment. I'm interested in fallacies. But I'm not only interested in logic, and I mean, I guess even from the last thing with the pragmatic stuff and accommodation, I think, like once it's in the truth conditions for the logical constant, right? It has consequences for the entailment relation, but then it'll have consequences for what gets said when people are having conversations, and also for which pragmatic things are triggered. And so it's natural to push it further. Of course, like, from the perspective of just wanting the truth, right? It doesn't matter to me whether it ends up being semantic or pragmatic, and really struck by the thought that it might vary from language to language, whether it was pragmatic or semantic. But your example with tu and vu even seems to suggest something like that English and French would be, well, modern English and French would be different in that respect. So in the end, it doesn't really matter. If it's going to be psychological modeling, it's probably not me that's going to be doing that work. But that doesn't mean that I don't think it sounds like it could be interesting and promising.
Right.
And possibly, like, one thing I also think is, we have this idea that logic is so pure and so clean, and so we're going to use it to do mathematical logic, and we're not going to use it for any social stuff, right? And then it turns out, oh yeah, we can do it like necessity and some things like that, and then oh yeah, there could be ordered possible worlds, and I think I like the idea of getting logic a bit dirtier.
Cool. I was sort of, yeah, I mean, I'm curious what you think in terms of this, the way I sort of try to explain the move from the conversation to the social game via social roles. It was precisely, I mean, one alternative, if you go with logic rather than association or probabilistic updating or something, was to sort of capture precisely the sort of a fallacy of affirming the consequent. If you think that you start your reasoning by saying, by default, people, if they have a social role, then they will have a conversational role, and then you sort of an oppressive speech would basically assign this conversational role. It looks like one here could infer basically that the social role, that they also have the social role, precisely because otherwise how could they have the conversational role? So it feels like it's sort of kind of picking on that sort of fallacy of affirming the consequent, especially if you sort of go with Guy's and Vicky idea of invited inference. You have any thoughts on that?
So, I mean, I don't know that I followed all of it. Where did the affirming the consequent bit come in?
So you start with a background assumption that if people have social roles, when you enter the conversation, you inherit this conversational role. And then second premise is
and then they're saying they have the conversational role and inferring they have the social role.
How is it that people hearers are kind of invited to infer that let's say the target has the corresponding social role, even though clearly they don't, but it's sort of, you kind of force that to make that fallacious inference.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible that some other social role could have determined the same conversational role, right? But I mean, I suppose they might also have in the background actually the conditional if they have this conversational role.
Yes, exactly.
Not necessarily.
Yeah, in a way. And
really fancy.
Yeah. You didn't want to, sorry. So I'm not sure, if there are any other questions or we want to close on this. If you have, any